Hello and welcome to Cymera, Britain's only book festival celebrating science fiction, fantasy and horror writing. My name is Anne Landman and I'm the festival's founder and artistic director. Right about now, I'd hope to be welcoming you to beautiful Edinburgh, to our venue The Pleasance, for a weekend packed with events. Writing workshop, panels, readings, open mics, a quiz, a ceilidh, 2 plays. We had so much in store for you. Thank you for joining us online instead, to be part of our programme from the safety of your homes. We're very excited to still bring you a fantastic lineup of speakers. We'd ask you that you support our speakers, and there's many ways you can do that. You can buy their books or borrow them from the library. You can donate to them directly via their Patreon or Ko-fi. You will find the links for that below in the description. We encourage you to buy a ticket for our events, even the pre-recorded ones. All ticket money will go directly to our speakers. You can also donate to the festival, and all donations via the donation page will be split between our speakers, once we've covered our costs like the Zoom account. Thank you again for joining us in this brave new world of digital events. We hope you have a chance to check out all 33 of ours over the weekend. Please let us know what you think of them. Do get in touch via social media, the chat function in Zoom, or drop us an email on info@chimerafestival.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We hope you have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year for Cymera 2021.
Welcome, Camilla, and everyone else who has joined us this evening. Oh, a lovely 21 people. Very, very nice. My name is Eleanor. Welcome to Cymera Festival, the UK's only dedicated festival to science fiction, fantasy, and horror writing, because, in my words, genre fiction is fab. It's just become my byline now. I feel like I'm a bit of a game show host with this thing as well. I have the great pleasure of being able to welcome Tim and Clare and Vic James in their relevant squares in this wonderful online format. Thank you for joining Cymera Festival, who've gone digital for 2020. Hopefully, I will see you in Scotland in 2021. So just to let everyone know who has arrived, you will have the three of us for the next 50 minutes. I am going to introduce our authors, give you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of their lovely careers. They're going to give us a little introduction and sample to their wonderful writing, and then the three of us are going to have a really lovely chat. There is so much to discuss in this wonderful event called Alternate Realities, and then right at the end of this event we will certainly leave time to answer all your lovely audience questions. The beauty of this online platform is that you don't have to hold those questions in as you would have to in a physical space. By all means, share your questions with us over the course of the event, and then I will be able to come to them later on. You may notice that there is a Q&A, there's two speech bubbles overlapping like a text icon. Do click on that section and you'll be able to send questions to all the panelists, and everyone will be able to see those questions and we'll be able to share them with you and answer them live later on. So, got through my notes there. And breathe. Vic James, hi. Vic has lived in Rome and in Tokyo for 5 years, and you now live in London. You worked for Channel 4 News, and you now divide your time between directing current affair documentaries, mainly on political topics, and your writing. You are the author of the Dark Gifts trilogy. See, little item here, number 1 in the series there, my bookshelf. Are you gonna? This is not Vic's first rodeo. She's got all of them there already. That's set in an alternate contemporary England with a little bit of magic, and it won the Pix. Do you know how to pronounce the name of that prize?
It's French, my dear.
It's I know. I was like Utopia, Utopiale,
Yeah.
Utopiale.
Utopiale. Which I think a gorgeously sort of French take on what science fiction is there to do, right?
Yeah, it's called. I think that translates loosely as like the ultimate price, or the price you pay for a utopia, because there's always consequences, guys. Her latest book is thriller with witches, called Sanctuary. I have the hardback, and Vic has the paperback. There we go. And this one, Sunday, this is a Sunday Times bestseller, and as you can see, Vic has the lovely paperback version. Tim Clare is the author of The Honours and The Ice House, and We Can't All Be Astronauts, which is non-fiction. Yeah. Tim presents the creative writing podcast Death of a Thousand Cuts. I believe he's quite on for that one. For anyone who wants to know more about how to write a novel or writing great fiction or getting published, I direct you to that wonderful podcast. He also does, there's this Couch to 80K writing bootcamp, which is a free, totally free, no loopholes, 8-week writing course by podcast. You just got to write 80,000 words in order to take part. That's where it isn't free. There's a 80,000 words is what you got to pay. He's also a stand-up poet with several award-winning 5-star shows under his belt. Does he have time to sleep? I don't know. But these are our authors. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining Cymera in this slightly different fashion.
Thank you very much for having us.
Well, you're very welcome. How are you both doing at the moment, generally?
How traumatized do we look that you have to ask that question? I'm joining you from my yoga studio, my leisure centre workout room, from my local library. Yeah, no, I mean, lockdown's possibly been better for writers than most folk, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, I'm quite used to sort of, effectively being like locked in my room for a couple of months and not allowed out. So,
on deadline.
Yeah.
What about you, Tim?
Yeah, it's been, I've had a variety of different days. Let's put it that way. They actually had to change. I've been doing a lot of research on psychology, and they had to revise most of the research on life satisfaction that we used to have with psychology, because they realized when people filled in surveys saying how satisfied are you with your life, over 70% of that was dictated by the mood they were in at the moment that they wrote the survey. So if someone just has a bad morning or is hungry, that can make them rate their satisfaction with their entire life 70% lower than they would if they just have had a lovely morning and had maybe a lovely sandwich, right? So I think, lockdown is like, for me, sometimes has been like normal life, only more so.
Yeah, I think if anyone who works as a freelancer or works from home, maybe people do feel that was a slightly less of a shock to the system, but at the same time, it's we all like to leave the house. It sounds so simple right now. Oh, lovely, great. So, alternate realities. Let's kick this off. Vic, would you please introduce us to Sanctuary and set the lovely scene for your lovely first adult novel for us?
Well, Sanctuary is the name of the town it's set in, and yeah, I mean it's basically a thriller with witches. Somebody quite early on said, "My God, it's bigger." Emma Kavanagh, bless her, look, we liked it so much we put it on the back. She said it's Big Little Lies with witches.
I think that's a good description, actually.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of set in a sort of small, swanky coastal town in Connecticut, in America that looks almost exactly like our America, except witches are real. They're very much sort of a part of everyday life. If your relationship is a bit rubbish, then you might go to a counsellor or a therapist or a divorce lawyer or a witch. If you're sort of feeling aches and pains, you might take up yoga, or you might get some painkillers, or you might go see the witch. So that's kind of the context of the world. And yeah, in this sweet, quiet, well-off little town, which has one sweet, well-behaved witch, a boy dies at a house party, and the prime suspect is the witch's daughter. So the question then becomes, did she do it? And if she did she do it by magic, which is a very, very, very illegal thing. So yeah, that's basically the premise of the book. Just to backfill very quickly on these three, so these are set in an alternate contemporary Britain don't know if it's just like me being lazy or what. It's like, hey, let's take the real world and
Oh,
throw
the
it
ultimate
magic.
reality.
Yeah. So these ones are sort of set in an alternate contemporary Britain with magic, in which the sort of like the 1% elite. I was making a documentary about billionaires, as you do, and after a sort of strange week of actually talking to some of these folk, I kind of just sort of went home and just sort of thought, my God, you know, like they have so much power, it's almost like magic. So then I went in and wrote the books. So yeah, you know, I like real life, but I just think magic makes it better.
I don't think anyone attending this festival is going to disagree with you. I mean, otherwise,
I'm with my kind.
Run a Cymera, let's be honest. So this wonderful event is called Alternate Realities, and you know, as you've said, with the two different books that you and the series that you've written, there are potentially links to our world. There are slight differences, or there can be much larger differences between the ones you know and the ones that you know a writer can create. So starting with Vic, and then I'll come to you, Tim. Why did you both decide to, I suppose, have a take on this route? Because Tim will be able to discuss the honours and the Ice House in a moment, but of course you both have quite different approaches to that. What would you say, Vic? Would you have rather simply had, like, I mean, you say that you like the world, you know, like our world straight, you know, being able to make those little tweaks to both of your series?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it kind of sort of, it really lets me do two things. You know, sort of one of them is put dragons into books and magic, which is always a better fit. You know, I am a huge sort of genre reader and a genre fan, and I just love the pedigree of you know, the world that we can't see. You know, I was always one of those children that kind of used to bang the back of the wardrobe, you know, kind of hoping that Narnia was there, and you know, I haven't found it yet, but
let me know when you do, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So you know, so part of it is just sort of simply that, you know, I live in a world of magical thinking. The other thing, I guess, is maybe just a sort of a very sort of nice intellectual conundrum, which is that sometimes, you know, the issues and concerns of our world can feel almost kind of overwhelming, you know, incredibly close, hard to process, hard to handle. So trying to look at sort of some of those structures, and, you know, we might talk a little bit later about how you've got to be really, really careful that you're not sort of trying to create sort of fake or misleading analogies between, you know, sort of fantastical conflicts or inequalities and sort of real world conflicts and inequalities. But nonetheless, it can be a way of working through or sort of making fresh, or, you know, like it allows you to take a sort of a step back from the world, but still to engage with, you know, sort of issues and concerns that are sort of really dear to your heart. I mean, you know, I always liked that quote, which I think Neil Gaiman first of all attributed it to G.K. Chesterton, and then remembered that actually he'd made it up himself. But it's that sort of brilliant quote about, you know, sort of fairy tales. The value of fairy tales isn't that they tell you that dragons exist, but that they tell you that dragons can be beaten. And I like both of those ideas. I love a world in which dragons exist, and I think it's important to have faith in a world in which dragons can be beaten.
Yeah, I like that quote. I know that quote very well. Tim.
Hello.
Hi. Would you tell us a little bit more about your lovely series here, and also tell us a little bit more about what drew you to creating a world that is, you could say that there are elements that people might recognize, but then there are strong sections that some would say go in a slightly different direction. Yeah,
so like the honours is set in, I really like the opening sort of bid on the back of the honours.
Sorry.
In the kind of like the beginning of the Star Wars title crawl on the back is 1935 Norfolk.
Yes.
Which admittedly is not kind of like
yeah.
It doesn't seem like the most exciting kind of time and place. We wouldn't think in the kind of whole of the 20th century that's the kind of crux of where the action's going to happen. But that's indeed where the book starts. And I guess it's kind of has some of those kind of like interwar, like radio serial adventure kind of stories are part of its DNA. I definitely think that it's got part of the kind of like, not so much the kind of like bits of the Penny Dreadfuls, but also the Halfpenny Bloods.
See that.
And actually, I think that the Honours owes a lot up to, and this is going to sound awful because it doesn't actually inform the politics of it, but the kind of like when the kind of like the Daily Mail started kind of appropriating parts of like the Penny Dreadful to write essentially xenophobic war stories about how, you know, the French are at our doors and are going to blow up the, you know, big pictures on the front of their children's comics of like Big Ben being exploded by French bombs and just ludicrous xenophobia like that. But I think that feeds into the main character. The main character is a 13-year-old girl called Delphine, and like that's the diet she's grown up in. Her dad's a veteran of the Great War, and she fully buys into it. She fully thinks that the communists are right now starting a plot to invade Britain because they are, and so that kind of like feverish place and the kind of like John Buchan novels of, this is the thing, I'll tell you why this book exists, is because my grandfather once gave me 2 books that he recommended I read, and I read them back to back, and they were the 39 Steps and then The Hobbit, and I went, these are the same book. I was like, somebody is sitting at home and then somebody comes and pesters them and they have to go out on a long, essentially quest, but kind of a game of hide and seek. And then there's a big war that they're only tangentially involved in. But it's basically just someone is sitting at home reading the paper and then something bad happens. And those are the DNA of the 2 things. Despite the fact I think everyone who reads it gets increasingly xenophobic, and his prejudices achieves a kind of equality in the sense that his main character seems to hate everyone from every country on Earth, but just for different reasons. But so the Honours starts off in 1930s, and then the Ice House is set in 2009 mainly, and it's the same character from the Honours. It's Delphine, but she's an old lady, and it's about what happens to these children who go on amazing adventures or discover fiendish plots or whatever. What happens to them after the end, and what happens when the story's over, and what kind of life do you lead after having what by anyone else's standards would be an incredibly traumatic, like earth-shattering experience. So really it's and the Ice House, the one where Delphine's an old lady, is the one that I thought of first, and it's the one that I wanted to write first. And originally the Honours was just going to be a prologue, and then it grew, and I was like, oh, I've got to write this. I don't really know anything about the era. I guess I'm going to have to research it now. But the Ice House was the one that I wanted to write, but then the Honours had a story in it, and then I discovered that I wanted to write that one as well.
Yeah. Well, no, your historical research is brilliant. I think that was one of the things I really like. Just to say, with the reference to what it was like for characters who experience a particular unique event, and then what happens to them later on in life. I did have there was a moment where I was reading The Ice House, and The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell popped into my head, and I was just like, but I hadn't read anything quite like it when I read The Bone Clocks. Unfortunately that was my first David Mitchell, but yeah, I felt that was very much that felt like it's a very interesting thing to explore, and just trying a different perspective on it. So when you say you started with the original idea you had was the Ice House, what was it that made you think about having certain elements in the world that we recognize, and then having those other elements that people hint at that are not something that people would necessarily recognize?
Yeah, I mean, like obviously, like without dancing around it, the reason that I'm scheduled in this festival is because
Yes.
there are genre elements to it, which I'm not actually dancing. I'm dancing around them to avoid spoilers, rather than any sense of shame, or that this is like somehow a literary
Cymera festival,
novel. And
be loud and proud about your
yeah,
genre.
exactly. I want to make it really clear. I'm not one of those people who has to have another word, not the F word, because I'm actually, if people don't feel they're writing fantasy, that's absolutely fine. If that's not what you're writing, that's fine.
I know we have some names, but I don't think Ian McEwen is attending today. I think.
Yeah, well, no, well, quite. Yeah, no, but like I love the genre. It's what I read. It's where my heart is. So it's not that. It's just I sometimes come at things sort of like sideways, and I think, I don't know, I just think that real world is really, really interesting, and it's so weird. And I was so interested in secret societies and reading about them, and how when you read the histories of them, genuine ones that existed, their beliefs are absolutely wild. Like the stuff that they believe, the knots that certain sort of fascist secret societies had to tie themselves in, because all the scientists that had come up with so many key parts of our understanding of the universe were Jewish. So they just had to try and go, well, that can't possibly be right. So how do we explain? And then they come up with just bizarre stuff, because if you believe one sort of completely bananas prejudice, your entire worldview gets skewed around that in a way that then all bets are off. And I find, I just find that fascinating. I love the fact that none of them last more than 5 years, because they always have an argument and split up. I love their belief in magic and the way that they practice magic, but no one can actually make magic work in any obviously. I mean, one of the main influences for the honors is a guy called Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff, who was kind of like came off the sort of tailcoats of theosophy with Madame Helena Blavatsky. But from what I can tell, like when I originally read stuff about G.I. Gurdjieff, it was all very approving. Like, this guy is this incredible kind of Armenian dance teacher who would kind of taught all these socialites how to kind of like free themselves from the constraints of the conscious mind. And then you actually read contemporary sources and get actual dialogue from him, and the guy is the guy is either a charlatan or the most self-deluded. I mean, you can be both, right? But it's a lot of it is just like, and because people love him so much in that secret society, they don't actually hide what they're reporting. So they'll report him doing the most atrocious things and going, this is a sign of his genius. So him just like yelling at someone, like screaming at one of his associates to give him more money. And then like a butler comes in with some food, and he switches to like, oh, hello. And then he goes back to screaming at this guy, and they're going, he had such incredible control over his emotions. You go, no, he's just a psychopath. Like it's like the diaries you get from like Napoleon's valet, right? Where he doesn't edit them because he thinks his master can do no wrong. So actually you get this incredible unreliable narrator. And that's what I got around Gurdjieff. And the character partially based on him, Mr. Prop in the book, actually is a bit more complex than I think Gurdjieff was, and maybe a little bit more morally grey. But those are the places I was starting at. Like so much of the book is based on very, very real stuff and real people. And I think like the fantasy stuff in a way is the least weird.
So that was definitely a cackle there. I'm very sorry. Just to say, that whole time when Tim was explaining it, and your enthusiasm was fantastic, but then Vic and my facial expressions were responding in a very similar way at each point, and it was very funny. So yeah, the next stuff now is going to be Tim saying very fascinating things and being incredibly engaging, and then Vic and me just going, At one point, can we burst out laughing? Vic, you look like you have something to add to that.
And say that I just love that 20th century sort of theosophy scene. So I'm lucky enough to live in London, and I go to Treadwell's bookshop, which is a sort of occult bookshop.
It's great, isn't it?
It's amazing. Like, we all love Treadwell's, and now actually, thanks to lockdown, you can get their lectures. You can subscribe to their lectures sort of digitally. So I was doing some housework this afternoon, and like, got to like tidy up a bit for you all to come and peep in. And I was listening to a lecture about just one of these figures from like the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and it's like you say, Tim, like you cannot make it up. I mean, you don't have to go very far in the real world to find things that are as sort of as fantastical, as implausible, if you like, as anything in a fantasy novel. I mean, these people, they are, like, they're making sort of ritual garments out of sort of bed sheets. They're kind of sort of carving their own little knives and sort of ritual objects, and yet, as you were saying, Him, the acolytes, their followers, their own writings, kind of completely buy into this. I mean, sort of reality is a story in itself. So yeah, Gurdjieff, the whole lot of them, absolute, just a rich theme. Wow.
Was that Treadwell's bookshop?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just checking I got that right. So yeah. So anyway, everyone, yes, thank you. Cymera have added. Oh, Irene, thank you, Irene. She's added the link. The lectures at Treadwell's in London. So if anyone wants to check those out, thank you, Irene, for sharing that in the chat there with everyone. I think I'm gonna have to add that to my ever-growing list of podcasts that I need to listen to. I've also got loads of audiobooks during lockdown as well. That's something else. So before we get too carried away, because obviously I feel that we could probably talk for a really long time. Tim, would you give us a little glimpse into the Ice House, as you said earlier, the bit where they're slightly closer to our reality, or not? Who knows?
Yeah, so I'm going to read a bit from where Delphine is. At this stage, she's at her cottage, and she is 86, and she's just burying her faithful Labrador Thompson, who's died that morning. I should say Thompson sounds like a reasonable name for a Labrador, but over the course of the books, it becomes clear that she names all her pets after different types of machine gun. So
she does know a lot about machine guns, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I had to do a lot of research about guns, and happy people don't know all the guns, do they? Like, it's not a good sign.
And can I just say, I love the fact, like, the one thing they say to writers is don't kill the dog. Now, not only have you killed the dog, that's actually the bit you're going to read us.
The dog.
Brave man.
The dog, as far as we know, died humanely, rather than, the dog wasn't killed. The dog simply passed away naturally.
Okay,
from old age.
I feel better about that now.
Okay.
Delphine stood in the elm copse, puffing on her pipe to keep warm. She gazed into the grave mouth. Half-buried roots threaded spine-like through the uneven, clayey soil. Thompson's eyes were closed, his coat a glossy velvet black. "Are you warm enough, darling?" she said. At her side, light was bending round an astigmatic smudge the size of a small suitcase. She took a hip flask from her waistcoat pocket. "It's just a nip." Her jaw contorted as the toffee and cinders taste broke over her tongue and the booze vapour hit the back of her throat. Good shooting brandy. She took a second, more committed nip. A stream cut across the northeast of the copse, swollen with runoff. The water passed beneath a wire fence into the neighbouring field. She squinted. It was hard to tell without her distant spectacles, but part of the fence looked like it had been ripped up where it crossed the flow. It was as if someone had shoved or dragged it into the air. The wire was twisted. A fence post hung in it, unearthed. How long had it been like that? Birdsong seeped through the constant dissonant ringing that underscored everything. She hadn't had a hearing aid, but it rubbed and the sound was rubbish. From the adjacent meadow came the chack, chack, chack of fieldfares amongst the blackthorns. Overhead, she fancied she could make out the high, sweet song of a coal tit. Perhaps she was just wishing. The old garden used to fill with them. Mother would hang feeders from the conifers. Algernon had liked to scatter sunflower seeds around his deck chair while he read. If he stayed still enough, one might perch on the end of his book, an improbable wonder of white cheeks and biscuit golden belly. I suppose I ought to say a few words. She looked down into the grave and tried to sound appropriately solemn. Thompson Venner, you were a patient, noble campaigner and a gentle, loyal companion. She took out his retractable lead. It was green textured plastic with a silver clasp. She had meant to toss it in after him, but she held on. Sad to see you go, old man. You met your fate with a stoic mien. She breathed in, the air cold against her teeth. Plastic felt rough beneath her fingers. Her hand was shaking. Why couldn't she let the damn thing go? Would you like to add something? The arthritis in her wrist had returned with the insistence of a deep radiating bruise. She pulled deeply on her pipe, sighed smoke into the breeze. It's all right, she said. No one will see you here. The smudge at her side began to fill out, becoming a distinct shape with edges. It was like watching mist clear or a camera come into focus. The last of the blur washed away, revealing a wine-red scarab, 18 inches tall, standing upright on two thick legs. Moisture had condensed on the segmented plates of her waxy carapace. She flexed the black palps either side of her mouth in a yawn. Well, said Delphine. Martha's jointed antennae sniffed the air, their two comb-shaped heads shivering. Dew had collected on the soft club-like tips of her outer mouth parts, and with a gentle rippling motion, she conveyed the droplets into her mouth. The smoked blue centres of her eyes shifted upwards, suspended in pools of bright ghost milk. Martha tramped towards her little green trolley, hooked feet knifing through a slime of brown clay. The trolley was heaped with oddments. She liked to roam the meadows, collecting things, governed by no discernible organising principle. A sheep's jawbone, a thumb-sized hunk of porous basalt, bog moss. She reached into the trolley bed, sifting through twigs, damp magazines, a tangle of old washing line. She retrieved something small and soil-clumped. It looked like a dead shrew. When Martha held it up, Delphine saw it was a tiny stuffed toy no bigger than a fist, a grey bunny. All its fur had been rubbed away. One of its ears hung ragged. Where on earth had she found that? It must have been very dear to someone once. Martha spoke 3 ratcheting upstrokes at the limits of Delphine's hearing. She tossed the toy into the grave. Delphine looked down. The little rabbit lay beside Thompson in the mud, its head resting on his jowl. There, she said, you finally caught one.
I feel like we have to have a moment for Thompson and the bunny there. Oh!
Can I also thank you for using the word palps?
You can, yeah.
That's a wonderful word. Palps. Oh, I love it.
Oh, Vic, if you haven't read The Honours of the Ice House, I do recommend it. The language and vocabulary is I think it's yeah, kind of like relishing the sounds, and as you said, you know, you're very much taking it back to the.
If you enjoy obscure Beatle jargon, you'll like it.
Irina said, "Bright ghost milk is fab." There you go in the chat there.
Thank you.
So we're going to keep chatting, but we do have some time for questions at the end. If anyone would like to pop them into the Q&A, do go right ahead there. Sorry, that whole reading has gone. Always knocks. I have to keep looking at my questions. Vic. I think Vic's just having a he's just typing palps there.
We're all just enthusing about the Beatle jargon.
None with a hard G. Yeah, this is a lot of love.
Mandibular manipulation.
So Tim, do you feel that there are any perils or pitfalls with I suppose what the event that we're doing is alternate world fantasy, but of course you feel that there may be more perils and pitfalls with the real world elements that you've already possibly referenced as.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is, I feel like there's perils and pitfalls with any fiction, but that's, you're asking specifically with doing alternate world stuff.
Yeah.
Like it depends what your goals are, really, what you're aiming to do. Like I think Vic really astutely pointed out, if you are trying to create a world that is a kind of one-for-one like analogy for some real world problem, there's no such thing as a one-for-one analogy, and the differences are going to be really interesting and possibly in a problematic way if your only purpose is to talk about something as a metaphor, right? And that's not necessarily an issue, right? Because, you know, like Orwell just does Animal Farm and he's just very blunt and on the nose, and he's just doing, there's no subtext to that book in the sense that it's very obvious what he's talking about. It's very obvious what the issues, I mean, there is one subtext, but it's one, huge glowing subtext, right? So you can do that, but for me, it undermines the entire enterprise of, God, that sounds really bad, like I'm just going in on Orwell. Orwell undermines doing that is more like doing a performance poem than a novel. The whole value of novels for me is the dialectic of fiction, is taking opposing ideas and forces. And frankly, like, people read the honours and so many people have gone, I wish I'd been like Delphine when I was growing up. And part of me is horrified because she's a paranoid gun-wielding racist. Like, she's sociopathic at points. She's borderline like fascistic in her outlook on parts of the world, right? And people are going, cool, I wish I was that cool, right? Which in a way I'm also delighted by, because people have been sucked in by the glamour of it. That's why people got sucked in, right? My grandma was a member of the Hitler Youth. My grandma did stenography for the Gestapo. I don't think because the same reasons that Delphine's interested in war and being tough, because you're scared, right? Because you're scared. My grandma was disabled from birth and mocked openly by her teachers. She wanted to fit in. What I'd say with alternate realities is that the danger is that you have an idea of a message you want to convey, you switch out something, and then you don't leave any, you've actually just sort of put your finger on the balance in a way that isn't very honest and actually kills your characters, because you don't have any, you're just not talking about the same thing anymore. On the other hand, the amazing thing it allows you to do is actually, you know, originality and genre is a very strong spice, and you only have to change one tiny thing for the whole world to be radically different. And so many people just doing like high fantasy in a completely new setting will change everything from the top down. There'll be magic, there'll be like kingdoms, there'll be 3 suns, there'll be floating islands, and you just can't, that doesn't create humans anymore. That doesn't create a world anything like what we've got, right? But they don't follow through on it. What alternate, like small shifts allow you to do is actually very honestly follow through on every aspect of the world building. Like actually follow those things to the end, because you've only tweaked a little one dial, which still changes everything, right? So that's what I think is interesting. And so, yeah, I think the perils are that you think, here's a way of me talking about a real world prejudice without actually having to feel uncomfortable. And you're like, well, no, you've just coded these characters in a way that's like pretty problematic and awful. And they've got some kind of like ancestral blood curse because, you know, they're vampires or whatever, but you're making them an analogy for another group of what? Hang on, that's not the same thing. So yeah, you've got to be really careful. But of course, like, look, but just to finish off, of course, like bits of fantasy can speak to real world things. Like, you know, like people have talked about, you know, Elsa in Frozen, to take a silly example, as like going, this is like someone's coming out story, right? Well, that's not what the story's about. No one went into it writing that, but people can see resonances in it. I watch Frozen with my 3-year-old daughter, and as someone with an anxiety disorder, I'm like, oh, this is about someone who's really socially awkward, who can go and be on their own and then not feel awkward, right? So that's the thing, is you can touch, people can choose to identify and touch on these things, but I don't think you can go into it going, this is what the story's about, guys, because it just...
Yeah, it's the whole, as a writer, you have to accept that you created a world and a story, and then when you hand it over to the readers, it's not going to be under your control anymore. You can't have a front page that says, this is what the story is about, and you can only leave.
You can, but what's the point? What's the point of writing a novel and doing that? Because you've written a lecture then. And I think the whole thing about the dialectic of fiction is I want it to spiral horribly out of my control. I want readers to see things that I didn't intend. I want it to work against me. I mean, that's the classic, that's the kind of most commonplace, that's, literary criticism commonplace about Paradise Lost, right? That Milton's accidentally written the devil as like this sexy anti-hero who basically wakes up in jail and goes, we're going to bust out. And you're like, yeah, awesome.
I didn't see that answer going in that direction. There you go. Vic, what do you think about the perils and pitfalls of alternate world fantasy? I kept following on from.
Yeah, I love that quote about Milton being at the devil's party and not knowing it, because I don't know, there's a little bit of me that likes to hope that Milton did know it.
He couldn't say that, could he?
No, well, but you never know what. I don't know. I mean, can you write? Yeah, you write your sympathies out onto the page, don't you? I mean, for me, it's a challenge I've had to kind of be really alive to in all of my books, because obviously I'm a journalist by training, and both of my stories kind of came out of very sort of real world moments. So like I said, like the original trilogy, the sort of unequal magic Britain, that was sort of sparked by, that was sort of written in the Occupy, all that rhetoric around the 1% and the 99%. And I was making a program and talking to that 1% or that 0.0001%. And that was kind of what triggered that world. So if you like, that was, I should be so lucky, but that was kind of like me being Orwell. That was me in those books saying, oh, look, here's a thing, and I'd really like to write about this thing, but it would be quite boring to write about it, as is. So let's write about it in this way. So the first trilogy was sort of, if you like, a lot more sort of straightforward in that respect. And then Sanctuary. So like the t-shirt I'm wearing now, I kind of put this on for you especially. It's a bit sort of old and faded now, but it's the sort of the Pussy Power, Pussy Riot t-shirt from, if you remember, the women's marches, sort of very early on in the Trump presidency. And I was there making a program about that. And I just sort of remember that sort of feeling and that moment at that time. This sort of incredible sort of female anger and kind of anxiety about authority. And Lana Del Rey, the singer, she sort of posted this sort of cryptic tweet that was kind of widely interpreted as being a sort of call to arms of the witches of America to hex Donald Trump. And then, I'm not passing any comment on that, but a sinkhole did then open up on the lawn of the White House. So that was, and that sort of planted a little seed, this connection between sort of magic and, sort of female anger, witchcraft and female anger. And of course that is, an association with really, really deep roots. But of course, when it came to write the book, and like Sanctuary has sort of been described as a feminist book, it also, I was writing it during when the conversation sort of like evolved to also take in the kind of the Me Too, the revelations, and then I was finishing the edits when we had sort of Christine Blasey Ford's testimony about Justice Kavanaugh and her allegations that he had molested her, had raped her at a frat party, and there's a scenario very similar to that in the book. So I was sort of writing kind of very close to reality, but at the same time, I, you know, sort of with this one, I maybe it's because I had sort of more experience as a writer. Maybe it's just because it's, the more you read and the more I try and educate myself about, you know, sort of not drawing sort of straightforward or problematic parallels, I felt the danger, the potential for that in Sanctuary was much higher. Like my trilogy is actually, I mean, it may sort of like look and walk and talk like contemporary Britain, but it is also very, very magical. It's very, very different. There's a lot of, you know, there's alternate worlds, there's sort of, you know, undead kings, you know, and dragons. So it feels very magical in a way that Sanctuary does not. Sanctuary is a very sort of mundane world. And yes, you know, I was aware that it could, you know, the way that sort of witches in this world are sort of feared, mistrusted, they are policed. So again, the cop who is investigating the alleged crime in Sanctuary is a Black woman. And again, you know, sort of at various points in the text, you know, she is reflecting on, you know, the way she sees sort of witches kind of sort of being marginalized and oppressed, and in her own mind, you know, sort of thinks about her personal experiences or those of her community. And again, I sort of thought, you know, my God, I don't want anybody, because it would be so dishonest and so misleading. I don't want anybody thinking that, you know, this is a book about, you know, a feminist book about female oppression, you know, or an anti-racist book about Black oppression. It's not an analogy, and it's 110% not an analogy. And the reason for that, of course, is that the witches in Sanctuary, the reason they're policed, the reason they are, you know, their lives are sort of hedged in with sort of rules and regulations, is that they have power. They have power. They're feared precisely because they have power. So you've got like a very fundamental kind of difference. And, you know, that was something that I had to sort of really very consciously work on and think about. And that was you know, like that was a fantastic sort of learning and growing experience for me as a writer. And you know, and then you have to sort of send it out into the world. It's like you were saying, you know, you send it out into the world and readers can kind of see what they want in it. And obviously I sort of sent it out, you know, like with my fingers crossed, you know, that people would not draw those kind of false parallels, because, you know, to me, that would have been irresponsible. And yeah, no, thank goodness they haven't. I mean, you know, it's interesting, you know, I mean, it sort of gets described as a sort of feminist book, and I'm very happy for that. But at the same time, you know, there is a lot in it about, it has real characters. It's not a tract. So you have these very sort of fractured, complex sort of female relationships as well in it. You know, it's about sort of friendships that sort of fall apart. And I think what it's about really, you know, for a writer, what it's about is making sure that your characters are complex and human and sort of act according to their own dynamics, you know, not because they are pieces that you want to move around to you know, to make a point or to draw a clever analogy, you know, like that's a book that's just dead in the water. Yeah, so that was something I was extremely conscious of when I was writing Sanctuary, and as I say, like I'm really grateful for sort of like, you know, the time that being able to focus on writing a book like that sort of gave me to explore, you know, exactly the sort of things you've been talking about there, Tim.
Oh, this is turning into so much going on in this particular event. This is lovely. Would you give us a little reading from Sanctuary to share your world with us?
Yeah, spot the
subtle marker in the book there.
Yeah, so this, I mean, you know, the sort of the bit I've got here is about, you know, so before I was a journalist, I was a historian. And this is the other great thing. Like when I was an undergraduate, I thought, my God, yeah, I'm so rubbish at history. Like, why did I choose to do this? Because I can't remember all these facts. And you know, like for a long time, I was sort of blundering around with this sort of totally mistaken idea that history was facts. And it took me a bit longer to realize that actually, no, history is just story. at that point, I sort of decided I liked it a bit more, and I ended up doing I did a PhD in history, and I love just inventing like historical backstory. So in the trilogy, which just as well, because in the trilogy I had to invent like 2,000 years of historical backstory. Almost none of it is on the page, but I had to understand it to understand kind of like why my world functioned the way it did. So this is rewriting a bit of American history to take into account the presence of witches. So we're hearing from the point of view of Sarah, the town witch, and she has been waiting up for the return of her teenage daughter, Harper, and she has to kind of break the news to Harper that she's been accused of murder. It's not long after sunrise, and I'm dozing in my grandmother's rocking chair in the kitchen, taking a break from some insomniac late-night ingredient prep, when my spell activates and every clock, bell, and chime in the house rings at once. Harper bursts in, furious. When did my girl get so angry? What the fuck, Mom? You hexed my door? We need to talk. I never ask where you go, but you've missed 2 days of school and a lot more besides. Not likely. There's nothing to miss in this place. And I know that she just means school and parking lot gossip and coffee shop hangouts and all the usual routine of teen life, but that nothing to miss cuts deeper than my blood offering blade. Harper, I'm serious. Sit down. Sullenly, she drops onto a kitchen chair, drawing her feet up to the edge of the seat. She rests her chin on her knees and watches me. What? How do you tell your child that she's been accused of murder? How do you tell your daughter, bereft of the gift, that she's been accused of doing it by witchcraft? How to explain that a woman who has known her since she was born believes her capable of it? I have to try. Without scaring her, I have to tell her the truth. And right now, speaking feels more difficult than any spell. I had a visit from Abigail, I tell her. She told me that someone has gone to the police and testified that you were responsible for Daniel's death. Harper goes rigid. That sullen gaze turns shocked and disbelieving. At the party? It's ridiculous, of course, but it's going to mean that the detective will be back with more questions for you. That's impossible. I was nowhere near Dan when he fell. I was on the stairs and he was on the landing. And here's the hardest part. The subject that it felt like betrayal even to discuss with Abigail, my daughter's lack of the gift. I reproach my friend, if she is still my friend, for forcing me to reopen this wound. The witness says you did it by witchcraft. By witchcraft, Harper repeats. Then I'm amazed to hear her laugh. Well, in that case, there's nothing to worry about. I'm afraid it's not that simple, darling. I can hardly bear to tell her. While the United States legal system is perfectly happy to indict crimes performed by magic, it doesn't permit evidence obtained by magic. Thank Alexander Hamilton and his Federalist Papers cronies. They got it written in as an amendment. None shall be convicted or acquitted upon evidence derived by means unnatural. The logic was that witches would cover up for each other, that they'd always say that magic wasn't used, or that they tried to shift blame by accusing the innocent. In short, that witches were fundamentally untrustworthy. What that means is that Harper's failed right of determination can't be used to prove to a court that she lacks the gift. And guess what? Science has no way of telling either. There's no fingerprint test. Our blood doesn't glow, our DNA doesn't have a third spiral. Medicine draws a big fat blank when it comes to identifying us witches. Essentially, once someone says they've seen you use magic, proving that you're not a witch is as impossible now as it was back when they ducked you in the village pond and the only proof of innocence was drowning.
Woo. If anyone in the audience has particularly enjoyed the readings this evening, then do please look up Sanctuary and the Honours and the Ice House. Cymera Festival will share a link in the chat to Blackwell's bookshops, but also to the event posting, so you can double check book titles. Thank you, Camilla. She's loved both the readings. Do support our authors as much as you're able to do. Obviously, buying their books is a brilliant way of being able to do that. Of course, Cymera Festival has put on a lot of the events this weekend on for free. If you are able to donate anything, do know that this does go straight to the speakers who have given up their time to be able to talk to you about their writings. Oh, we have so gone over time, but we're not finishing just yet. I know, Tim, it's fine. I already apologized to our wonderful IT support at Cymera, but Carmela has asked us a question, so we're going to finish with the one question that's been asked to us. So for both of you, do you go into writing a novel without a clear idea of theme and then realize what the theme is later? Or do you always have the theme in your mind as you write? So you may have hinted at this already a little bit, but Vic, would you like to answer that first?
Yeah, theme is an interesting one. I mean, I don't really think in terms of theme. I mean, for me, like, character comes first, plot comes second, because I guess sort of theme is the sort of the big picture of what's it about. Yeah. And I never really think about sort of what's it about. You look back at it afterwards when you kind of finished it and you're like, oh yeah, I guess. But for me, it's that sort of flashpoint of like characters. I mean, like the characters in my trilogy, like have been with me for years. Like I had dragged them through several different worlds before they ended up in this one. So I knew them really intimately. And just sort of like none of the worlds that I dropped this group of people, these two sets of siblings, just sort of weren't their worlds. And then I sort of had that sort of, my God, I must write this about the 1%, the 99% and magic. And then I thought, oh, this is the world those characters belong in. So that was the order that story kind of came together. For Sanctuary, it was, it sprang out of like a place and a moment and women's anger, but the complexity of sort of female relationships. So again, I mean, that's why Sanctuary is sort of set in the US, because that's, where I saw that happen. That's where that story began. So yeah, theme is not something that I really factor in. I just kind of tell the story that normally it's kind of, like the story is like a child sort of constantly like hanging onto your leg and it just won't go away until you kind of told it. So that's
very much something that you see when it's all there and you're like, oh, I didn't. It's nice that there are, then you suppose that's the point where you start to see them. Tim, what about you?
I think I don't want to get into trouble with my last response by saying something that I think is like quite witty and then actually turns out to be. So look, basically, I think that theme is often something that, especially people who've done like literature degrees, where we're encouraged to kind of do as a kind of performance, to have an opinion on theme, the themes of books. It's almost like what makes something literature, as opposed to the more sort of like frivolous world of genre fiction and commercial fiction. There's this idea that it's what I feel like personally, it's what I feel like ruins the books of William Golding, is like occasionally he'll write like these incredible, like The Inheritors, which is all about these kind of like kind of like human, just like humans, not quite humans yet, like learning about abstract thought and stuff. And you have these amazing scenes really in characters' minds, and then occasionally he'll break out into this kind of naff kind of like TV, like this kind of like voiceover going, but little did Og know that like as he did it, his tiny Neolithic brain could scarcely comprehend the gulf. And you're like, no. And I think that's what won him the Nobel Prize in the end, is like that willingness to step out and go, this isn't just about boys on an island. Actually, it's about man's inhumanity to man and original sin. I don't really care. You know, I could have figured that out with myself without you coming in and kind of like slamming a label on it. Like to me, what's interesting is that Ralph, there's a fire and he's being chased by people who are going to murder him, right? Like that other stuff comes through, but I don't need you to come in. Like, I think it was Henry James who said, like, the author should not intrude like a Greek chorus to underline his meaning. So like theme is something that someone, if they want to use it as a kind of string bag to hold the story together afterwards and explain it to themselves in their brain, I'm super happy for them, right? In the same way that I think genre isn't really something that a book is, it's a pair of spectacles through which you understand the text, right? And that's what I think about theme, is it can be a really nice way of like going, okay, how do we read this book if we think the theme is war? Sometimes that can give you a different feel as you go through the book, but it's just it's just a lens for the reader to put on. I don't think it's something inherent in the text. I think it's something that sometimes I feel like I should have a strong opinion about, because otherwise I'm not a real author and people will be a bit snooty about my work. But here's the thing, actually, I love dragons, I love the scarabs, I love monsters. That's what I'm in this game for. And
I think we're all here for dragons, scarabs, and monsters. Yeah.
And so theme, if someone has an opinion about it, that's lovely. But it's not something as an author that I care about. And it might be something, like Vic said, that afterwards I go, oh yes, I do see how that might be the case, but it's not something that I'm going into it honestly thinking about.
Sarek's commented in the chat there that you're saying, so show through subtlety and not tell with a baseball bat.
So the only thing I would say is I got so ingrained in show don't tell that I sometimes just came off as coy and irritating, because I'd be like, oh, well, maybe I'll leave you to decide. And actually, I think the best bit in the honours was when I was really near the end of writing it, and I suddenly just wrote with a narrator who is, I think implicitly to me, is Delphine, an older Delphine looking back on her life. But like a couple of things where I just said, this is what she thinks. And she is in love with this other, with like her schoolmate, like, and this is how she feels. And this is how the school feels about her. And this is her reputation. And I was like, this is good writing. And it's all telling, but it's telling with a voice, and it's telling with an authorial voice. And you can do telling so brilliantly. But then of course it's always slightly showing, because then actually you're being told by a clear storyteller. So I think,
sorry, and that bit where you're referencing is that you've also done it at a point in the book where you've been largely showing, like, that whole previous time. So maybe the reader has a hypothesis or has particular opinions and then, or suspicions before leading up to that particular section, and like, either their ideas will be confirmed or not. And it's like, if not, then it's adding that extra layer of.
So what I would say, I think I know how to explain this now. I think I might have actually cracked it. Is tell as an incitement, don't tell as insurance. So what you mustn't ever do is do telling as coming in after you've perfectly explained something through a gesture to go, oh, by the way, he's upset. That's why he slammed the door, right? That's awful. Going in and saying, like, he was a furious man covered in tattoos who could be perfectly nice to people when he wanted, but he never wanted. That's all telling, right? And I'd be like, cool, I know that character. I'm ready to see him in action now. So you can do, but what you wouldn't want to do is show that character being kind of like horrible to people, and then come in afterwards and go, by the way, let me just, in case you don't understand that character you just watched, in case you're a dum-dum, let me explain who that is. That's the awful side of telling.
We have also had a comment about dialogue tags, but that's a topic for another time. We have definitely gone over our time, and Holly has snuck a little question at the end there. So can you, in one sentence, answer the question, do you both plot? And if you do, then how roughly do you plot for prior to starting to write? Tim, you go first. Do you plot before you write?
Prior to starting to write, not at all. And then normally when I'm 3/4 of the way through and I realise it's not working, yes, I very quickly bodge something together to try and reach the end.
Excellent. I like the brevity there. Vic, your turn.
For the trilogy, it had a start point and it had a finish point, and I had one or two sort of like way markers along the way. I just sort of kind of let my characters find the path. Sanctuary was a different proposition because it is a thriller, so that was very intensely plotted. But even so, it was very important to me to kind of like to let the characters off the leash, and you know, a couple of other characters, like one of them sort of like walked on stage a third of the way in and said, hey, you didn't know it, but you really need to meet me here. And they became, you know, like one of my favorite characters in the book. And in retrospect, I just think, you know, how did I think I could have written this book without them? So yeah, plotting is always helpful depending on the structure and shape of the story you're trying to tell, but plot isn't life, only characters are life. Yeah.
Those are two wonderful answers. Holly, I hope that answered your question, and thank you very much for squeezing that one in. Cymera, we've gone over time, but for all good reasons, because I think we could just keep going. Thank you for our audience for joining us this evening. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Vic. If you'd like to buy books, if you are in a position to do so, do support your local bookshop, because we would like them to come back. And do join me in thanking Cymera Festival, the UK's only dedicated science fiction fantasy genre festival, a horror writing festival as well, because, as I've said before, genre fiction is fab and we love Cymera. So thank you, Tim. Thank you, Vic. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, we're gonna disappear seamlessly now. But thank you both so much.
Bye, everyone.
It's been lovely. Thank you. Bye.